If you could say anything to the people that put you in that orphanage, what would you say?
Would tell him that they stole my whole childhood.
Right now, over 5.4 million children are trapped in orphanages around the world, and over 80% of them are not even orphans. Today, we're finding out why orphanages are vehicles for abuse and lifelong trauma for millions. Welcome to Wales, Africa and the World. My name is Peter Gilbey, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Mark Riley, Senior Programme Lead at Hope and Homes for Children. Hope and Homes has, since 1994, been working to stop the institutionalisation of children, fighting to bring millions of separated children back to family. Mark is an expert in this field and, in his own words, a brash, passionate and opinionated Welshman. He spent 13 years living and working in East Africa on care reform, helping countries move away from the orphanages system to a more healthy family care system for children. He advises on programmes globally for Hopes and Homes for Children. So Mark, before we get into the meat of the discussion today, let's do a little bit of an autobiography. Who are you and what's your background?
So my name is Mark Riley. I work for Hope and Homes for Children. I worked for many years with the Welsh Assembly Government on EU grants, and in 2010 I moved to Uganda to work on what we call childcare reform. And it's quite an interesting journey how I got there and here. I
guess let's go into the core issue then. At the top of the episode, we heard from a former resident of an orphanage speaking on a Hope for Homes and Children campaign video that placing her in an orphanage, quote, stole her childhood. For many listeners, orphanages might seem like actually a safe haven for vulnerable children. What's the harm in that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is still a discourse that orphanages are somehow helping vulnerable children or children who've lost parents. That isn't the case. I mean, orphanages are quite a new phenomenon, really. If you go back, thousands of years, there was no such thing as an orphanage. Unfortunately, orphanages have become a part and parcel of sort of colonial rule as well. So if you think about a lot of orphanages in Africa, they've crept into societies with the colonial empire, if you like. Also in America, the first orphanages were to house indigenous children, to westernize them, strip them of their culture, strip them of their heritage, strip them of their families, westernize them, convert them to Christianity. So the history of orphanages is quite recent, hundreds of years. Even Charles Dickens was writing about orphanages, not in a positive way. But there's still a general perception that orphanages are good places. However, there is a lot of research and evidence to show that orphanages are incredibly damaging for children. Being separated from family is traumatic enough, but children growing up in an orphanage, they don't have the care and protection of a carer. They don't get their individual needs met. They have challenges adjusting to life outside the orphanage when they leave. There's something called an attachment disorder, which is where children can't attach to adults. A normal part of childhood development is that you attach to your parents or your primary caregiver. That doesn't happen in an orphanage. There's lots of turnover of staff, lots of turnover of caregivers. A child can't attach. And if they start to attach, the carer disappears because they're a paid worker and they may leave and they come and go. So a child will eventually just stop attaching to anyone. And that causes significant problems when children grow up. And those early years are really important. Being separated from your family in those early years is really important. So when children are placed into institutions at a very young age, all of the things which happen to them can last a lifetime in terms of the damage and cause and effect of being in an institution.
That does make a lot of sense when you explain it like that. I think, if you imagine a child going through the trauma of losing their parents and then being placed in this institution where at best there's no parental care, at worst there's probably a lot of abuse. I'm sure listeners will be surprised to hear that over 80% of children currently in orphanages have at least one living parent.
Yeah.
Why would children be separated from a parent? I'm sure a lot of people would have thought that everyone in an orphanage doesn't have a parent.
Yeah.
Why would they be separated?
Sometimes the existence of an orphanage in a community, which is a poor community, is a pull factor to place children in an orphanage. So in Africa, a lot of Africans depend on boarding schools to educate children, and often an orphanage is seen as a free boarding school. Parents wouldn't understand the damage that separation from their family and from their community does to children. So often it's caused by poverty. So a lot of children are separated from their families because of poverty. I've seen a lot of orphanages masquerading as boarding schools and boarding schools masquerading as orphanages, depending on where they can get the funds from. Also, I think we need to unpack the word orphan a little bit. It isn't a word I particularly like. I've got a friend called Dan Hope, who's a lion in this sector, and he says, if you label a child an orphan, people will respond to the label, not the individual needs of the child. And I think that is really, really important to understand. We made a mistake as a global community in the 1990s when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was raging by redefining the word orphan as a child who's lost one or both parents. Well, honestly, I mean, my understanding when I was small was that an orphan was a child who didn't have any parents, who lost both parents. And we redefined it because I think that we wanted to shake the world into recognizing the challenges of the HIV/AIDS epidemic without understanding the damage that would do. As an example, in Uganda in the 1980s and 1990s, there were very few orphanages, literally a handful. And there was a movement then to close and transition those orphanages. With the AIDS epidemic, it just saw a flood of Western money and missionaries coming to Uganda, building orphanages. Almost all of the orphanages in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa are funded by Westerners. So that saw a real explosion in the 1990s and early 2000s of orphanages, but very much a Western idea.
Okay, let's focus now on the harm of institutionalizing what goes on in an orphanage. What is the harm that's happening?
Firstly, orphanages don't offer the family care that every child needs, the love and care and protection, and to grow up with their parents or their grandparents, their siblings. So removing a child from that situation, and we can talk again about some of the issues why children are separated, but by placing them in an orphanage, in an institutional setting, children do not get the care and protection that they need. There's been a lot of research done on the actual impact, emotional and physical impact of growing up in an institutional setting. And I know that we will link to some of these resources, and there is a website called the Better Care Network, which people can search out, which has an amazing amount of reports, tools, research, and stories of transformation of where orphanages have transitioned. But the one thing the evidence shows us is that institutions are not good for children. Children who leave institutions have significant challenges. There's higher rates of suicide. There's higher rates of falling into joblessness and not being able to hold down jobs. There's higher rates of not being able to, maintain a healthy relationship. Children from institutions are more likely to end up in conflict with the law. So there's a huge amount that we learn from children who've left institutions and what they tell us. So part of Hope and Homes, what we do is we work a lot with care leaver networks. So those people who have lived experience of growing up in an institution, they tell us there was a better way. I shouldn't have been placed there. I was abused. I was neglected. Foreigners used to come and I used to be forced to sing and dance for these foreigners, and then they used to leave and I used to get beat. Even institutions which perhaps claim to have a lot of resources, a lot of funding, they look great, they still can't provide that care and protection that every child deserves and is a human right for a child to grow up in a family environment. Orphanages can never ever provide that, however much resources you throw at an institution.
I think it's amazing. It strikes me as amazing that there are millions of children leaving these institutions with these real life experiences and testimonies, and it's still so prevalent. Orphanages are so prevalent. All this body of evidence, UN reports, international sort of observers collecting this information, these first-hand testimonies. Why is it that it's still ongoing, do you think?
I think you're right. There's a huge body of evidence that institutional care is damaging for children. But we still see people willing to support and jump in and support orphanages. Part of the problem is the media will still elevate and idolize people that support orphanages as being some kind of hero without recognizing the damage that orphanage is doing or that institution is doing that they're supporting. Recently, we had Massacre Kids on Netflix, Rhythm Within, which is a story of these dance group which was went viral, making YouTube videos during the pandemic, and they travel the world. And Archibald Productions made this, which is Prince Harry and Meghan's production company.
Right. Okay.
So they made this documentary. If you look at the documentary with a critical eye, maybe after this conversation, you'll see that it's really quite damaging to the kids. They've been separated from their families. It's often communicated as rescuing these children. But the stories that the Massacre Kids showed was one guy, he was living with his grandmother, but they were quite poor. So he was stealing some food. So they recruited him into the institution, and now he's talking about how he's dancing and singing around the world. Well, the grandmother's still poor. The community still has huge problems. He's been separated from his grandmother. Yeah. So, and there's lots of stories like that. And the documentary, sadly, will have a lot of people saying, oh, these wonderful African children singing and dancing without really understanding the damage that it's doing to the children, the damage that it's doing to the community. So you get this perpetual cycle of people thinking that orphanages are great. But you look at the history of orphanages, they are really, really damaging. We are still suffering from the effects of orphanages in Ireland, where even today, mothers haven't been able to find the children which were ripped from them and placed into orphanages in Ireland. You've all seen the film Philomena.
Yeah.
And I meet people like that all the time. And in Uganda, I met so many parents, so many mums who thought that they were placing their child into an orphanage for some short-term support because the orphanage wanted to feed them and educate them, and they thought it was the right thing to do because they were having a short-term crisis. Maybe they'd lost their job, maybe their husband had left them, maybe their partner had died, they didn't know what to do, so they put the child in the orphanage. And orphanages are all too ready to accept children. An empty orphanage doesn't make any money. So you need children in the orphanage to sustain it. I met these wonderful mums and grandmums looking for their children. When I started working in the Ugandan government, on my very first day, there was a queue of women outside the Children Commissioner's office that I was working from looking for their children. Like, they put their children in an institution, and then the institution said the child is gone. And we would find them. They've been adopted to the USA, and you'd see these blogs of families saying, oh, we adopted this orphan from Africa because the mum died. And I'm sitting across from the mum, right. And I'm finding their child online.
Yeah.
And then they get lost in the system, and of course they lose their language. They lose their culture. They lose the disconnections from very strong cultural connections. They disappear. They're often forced to adopt a new religion. So yeah, it's just a cycle. But the way that it often gets communicated in the media is orphanages are good and therefore you should support them. And yet most organizations in the world, Save the Children, UNICEF, Hope and Homes for Children, Lumos, Oxfam, Christian Aid, all of the big NGOs have made a decision many years back that we will not support orphanages because children need to grow up within their families.
It's really interesting talking about the power of media and how it can really warp reality to present something that's so damaging as so good. I suppose it's the nature of aid in itself. It lends itself well to the institution of an orphanage because you can say, right, this costs this much, give us 10 grand and we'll build this nice new shiny building, put your name on it. I'm sure it's not just the economic levers that are sort of has been pushing these. It's been perversely, the aid sector itself historically has been sort of driving this institution. And you did touch on it a moment ago. It makes Westerners, white people, feel good to build a fancy building and have these little African children say thank you.
Yeah.
So on that sort of topic of white saviorism, I recently saw a really excellent TEDx talk by the Australian Tara Winkler. Listeners, if you haven't seen it, search for her name on YouTube. She essentially set up an orphanage in Cambodia when she was 19, but went on a very quick journey, similar to what you're talking about, Mark, realizing she'd made a terrible mistake. She's gone on to be quite a big campaigner for keeping families together and closing down orphanages and residential care institutions. How much do you relate to her story?
Yeah, and I know what Tara's done, and it's great. In terms of an African example, I see it a lot where people involved in orphanages realize what they're doing is wrong, and then they have a complete turnaround and become advocates against orphanages. I'll give you a really good example. A friend of mine, the month I moved to Uganda in 2010, a lady moved to Uganda in the same month called Lucy Buck. And she set up an organization called Child's Eye Foundation. So I moved to Uganda to work with an organization to deinstitutionalize it and to implement a foster care program. And within a couple of weeks, I realized there was widespread sexual abuse in this place. So I pulled in some experts and we eventually closed the place down. At the same time, Lucy was setting up something called Child's Eye Foundation, a very well-funded, what she would describe at the time, a high-quality babies' home. And it was literally just across the road from where I was working. But we became friends. She realized pretty quickly it was the wrong thing to do. And you can pour an amazing amount of money into an institution. And she was into this baby's home. She had some amazing supporters. But she realized that, number one, a lot of the babies being abandoned, they could find the mums, and the mums just needed some short-term support to help them through a difficult time. So she started doing that. The other thing she did was she placed some of the babies into foster care while the long-term solutions were being sought for these children in terms of long-term placements back to their families. And she measured the children in a very well-funded babies home with a lot of carers and good nutrition and, nice place versus these children who she was placing into Ugandan families, and these weren't wealthy Ugandan families. These were just normal Ugandan families. And the indicators for the children was a world apart. I mean, the children who grew up in a family and in a community, even though they might not have had the same material or even nutritional food that was offered in the baby's home, those children did so much better and started to excel and started to meet their childhood milestones, which you would expect children and babies to meet. The children in the institution weren't. So she closed it down. And I got a huge amount of respect for her. She closed it down and she transitioned Child's Eye Foundation into an organization which is now helping prevent separation, placing children into foster care, training parents. They've got a grandmothers program, which is supporting grandmothers and extended family, in essence, to look after children rather than them being taken out of the family structure. So there's a lot of examples like Tara And Child's Eye Foundation work within the government structure, so they're recognised by the government and are providing services. So there are an enormous amount of examples where this transition has taken place. So Tara isn't alone. Going back to your comment about the media need to elevate these stories because these have a wider impact of benefit for communities and children rather than just placing children in an orphanage. And you're right, it's easy and it's lazy to support an orphanage. You see the pictures of children, you can click on a link. Within a minute, you've all of a sudden started donating 30, 40 pounds a month to support an orphanage or sponsor a child in an orphanage. That money keeps the child in an orphanage. It actually removes the impetus from the orphanage to reintegrate that child and support the child and to address the reasons why that child is in the orphanage in the first place. So you've actually condemned that child to institutional care by that 1 minute click. And orphanages make it very easy for you to do that. But it goes back to the Western idea that African children need to be rescued and saved. And we jump in with our solutions to do that. Orphanages were never a part of African culture. African culture, they would look after their own children when problems and challenges would happen in Africa and still do for the most part. But orphanages disrupt that in a bad way. It's
really disrupting in my head to hear your stories and your testimony, your expertise. It may be the same for a lot of listeners as well. The ease at which you can donate to an orphanage or sponsor a child, like you're sponsoring an animal, it's actually quite foul. There's a lot to be said about the effort that has to be made in this part of the world to decolonize everything. There's a lot of effort in the aid sector and the global solidarity sector to decolonize, but it has to reach further than that. And it requires work from people here in Wales and elsewhere in the West to just reset our thinking and change our minds and focus on the children. And, you were talking about how easy it is to donate to sponsor a child. If you actually focused on the children, you'd ask the question, well, how much of that money is reaching the child as well? How do you see decolonization, the work of decolonization, playing into this issue?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Peter. The example that I gave about Lucy Buck, she transitioned her organisation, Child's Eye Foundation, to be entirely Ugandan run completely. And I think we need to make more efforts like that. And also the thing that people often don't realise is organisations like Hope and Homes, we do something called system strengthening. And that's, we probably need to find another phrase for describing it, to be honest. But what it is really looking at the whole system. Looking at the laws, looking at the policies, looking at the implementation, looking at the services that families can access on the ground. Most countries in the world have signed up to the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child. Countries have a responsibility to implement it. And often, with our colonial minds, we jump in and start providing solutions with our money from our churches, from our communities, to fix things in Africa. But the governments in Africa have signed up to educate the children, to provide services, to make sure that children are free from violence, to make sure that they can go to school, to make sure they can access health and nutrition. And we jump in and we disrupt that, and our efforts should be withdrawn a little bit, and our efforts should be perhaps working with government on strengthening the whole system, because governments often want to do it, but they just don't know how sometimes. And there are experts in the world, thousands and thousands of experts in Africa, who could sit alongside governments and help them to, and this is what Hope and Homes does, help governments to implement a more sustainable system. And a part of that transition is helping orphanages or organizations working in communities to create a more sustainable system for families and children and communities, which will be there for forever. And I can give you some examples of that a bit later.
The sustainability aspect's really interesting because, going back to, the nature of aid and the sector, it can be really short-term and unstable, and certainly orientated around the priorities of the donor.
Yeah.
There's been huge disruption in the aid sector recently. USAID was almost decimated by the Trump administration and taken into the State Department. Prime Minister Keir Starmer halved the UK's aid budget, and similar cuts in the rest of the G7 countries. Generally, that's quite bad news for a lot of vulnerable populations around the world, certainly with regards to like public health. I suppose, is this also a chance to do things differently?
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you mentioned the US aid cuts and the cuts to foreign aid generally. I think two things can be true at the same time, that development funds and aid should be more focused to create more sustainability. I was working on a couple of US aid projects when Trump cut US aid completely overnight. And they were actually bringing experts together. So in India, there was a project which were bringing disability experts within India and bringing care reform experts to make sure that children were prioritized, children with disabilities were prioritized, and that services were being developed and they were linked to services so that they weren't shoved into these terrible institutions where they get no care and etc. Or they get placed into the institutions, because sometimes the institutions is the only place which had facilities for children with disabilities, without recognising that children with disabilities should be cared for within the community, and the community should have access to all of those kind of services. It was a very progressive programme. It was completely in line with the Indian government. They have a program called Mission Vatsalya, so it was helping the Indian government and the states within India to really focus on this. Of course, that was cut overnight. And I don't think we can ever be happy with 4.8 million children which will die because of the US aid cuts by 2030. And there is an online monitor that is monitoring that. Or we shouldn't be happy with the 30 million people which will be negatively affected by the US aid cuts. The whole narrative around the cuts from the Trump administration was lies and appalling lies. US aid, was it always perfect? Absolutely not. But they did have a policy of, certainly with the child funding towards childcare reforms, let's create sustainability. Let's bring in experts. Let's create local experts to help with this. So they were doing a really good thing. And to have it cut, I don't think any of us should be happy with that. It's terrible. It's appalling. And people should be brought to account for that, especially doing it overnight. If you want to give people a couple of years' notice to migrate their programs to other funding or to make them more sustainable, fine. But to do it overnight, I think was inhumane and evil. Does it give us some opportunities? Yeah, because there's no money in the sector, or there's not as much money in the sector. I think that we have to look at making and helping governments responsible for what happens within their own borders with children, making sure that they adhere to the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child. I know that the Sustainable Development Goals are up for renewal. I think that there's a great opportunity there to breathe some new life into them in the next few years and to make care a priority within the Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of the indicators are around health and nutrition and climate, etc., but let's also put care in there. So I think there are opportunities for sure. Transparency, accountability, decolonisation. I think that these are things that we all need to be looking at in our sector.
Let's talk a bit more about the opportunities and the success stories as well. Yeah. You've spent a lot of time in Africa working with organisations, charities, local people to dismantle these institutions. Has that happened?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Really important. Because there will be people listening that'll be saying, well, what about the children who do lose their parents? What about the children who can't stay with their parents because of abuse or neglect? Of course, we are not saying that we shouldn't have care systems for those children. What we are saying is they shouldn't be institutional care systems. So they should be foster care systems, or they should be what we call kinship care systems, where children are absorbed into the extended family to keep them within the family structure and the family unit. In Islam, there is something called kafala, which is exactly that, keeping children within their own communities. And we are seeing huge amounts of progress in certain areas. Rwanda, we're almost orphanage-free in Rwanda. So if you consider after the genocide, there was this, concentration on coming to Rwanda and building orphanages because so many people had unfortunately been terribly, tragically killed in genocide. Of course, it was a Western intervention. Rwanda, and credit to the Rwandan government, they said, actually, why are we relying on Western money and Westerners coming and looking after Rwandan children? We should be able to do this ourselves. So Hope and Homes have worked in Rwanda for a long time, and we've worked on helped Rwanda move away from institutional care settings to more community-based care settings. As an example, we've worked with many orphanages to repurpose them into community hubs. And these are community-owned community hubs. So rather than having 20, 30, 40 children in an orphanage, those children were safely reintegrated back to their family or placed into other families within Rwanda, within their community. And then the facilities repurposed to provide a huge amount of community services, parental support, vocational training. I've seen martial arts classes in communities. I've seen cookery classes. I've seen women attend classes where they've been cooking and then they're going out to the market and selling their wares. We've seen a huge transformation. So Rwanda's nearly at the point where there's no orphanages in Rwanda. Another country, Kenya. There is a care reform strategy in Kenya where they want to eradicate orphanages by 2032. So we are working in Kenya in Nakuru County where there's a huge number of orphanages, and we are working in one sub-county where there's 22 orphanages, and all have committed to transitioning away from providing institutional care. So we are on that journey with them. And it's really exciting. A part of it is setting up all of the necessary structures and linkages which you need to make sure that child protection cases are dealt with immediately. So rather than a child placed in an institution, you can deal with it within the community. So we previously, some years back, where there would be, orphanages would just be accepting children because there was a problem. Now there's very few children going into the orphanage system because the child protection systems are linked up and working much better. So if there's a problem in a hospital because a mum has passed away and there's a baby, the default isn't, I'll place the baby into an orphanage. The default now is, I work with the child protection systems and we work out what's going on. We'll get the we'll get the baby back into the family and provide the support necessary to keep the baby within the family. Same with street children. Rather than street children being just taken off the street and put into an institution, they will work with the child and get the child back to a community, to a family. And it's complicated and it's not easy and it can be messy and every case is different, but it is the right thing to do. But once you link up all of those systems, health, education, care, and the faith-based communities have a huge part to play in that as well, it can really transform communities. So there's a whole lot of examples. I could sit all day giving you examples, and I will give you one more. In Tororo, in Uganda, and again, it's Child's Eye Foundation, who is one of Hope and Home's partners in Uganda. We worked with the Tororo government, district government, because they made a commitment to close all of the orphanages in Tororo. And Tororo is a transit route between Uganda and Kenya. So there was a lot of movement of people. There were a lot of challenges, a lot of truck drivers coming, a lot of displacement, a lot of sexual abuse. So they made a commitment through the leadership of an amazing probation and social welfare officer, which is the name of the person who's responsible for children. Huge amount of political will, and that is really critical. Political will is there to transform these systems. And Tororo did it. They went from having, and there wasn't a huge amount of orphanages in Tororo, but they close them all or repurpose them. And a good example, and I know that online we have some case studies of this, there was an orphanage called Smile Africa, and I remember going to Smile Africa, going to Tororo, and Smile Africa turned up. This is probably about 2014. I'd written the guidelines for alternative care for Uganda. So as a part of my job in the Ugandan government was writing those, and we were going around the country popularising them and telling people why they shouldn't have children in orphanages and we should start to move away. And there was one lady called Pastor Ruth who runs Smile Africa, and she came and she sat right down in the front, and I was there with my Ugandan colleagues, and she folded her arms because how dare somebody come and tell her that running an orphanage is wrong. And she just got it. She broke down, hearing of stories of children who've been brought up in an orphanage, and she realised she was doing the wrong thing. She really became emotional about it. So she repurposed her orphanage. So now that organisation provides immediate response. So when there's a problem with a child, a serious problem, they'll work with the local authority and they'll provide a response. And it might be that the child gets taken and placed into a foster family. It might be the family are provided with some short-term support. They also provide daycare. A lot of the reasons why children often end up in orphanages is because the parents have to work or the single mum has to work. But what does she do with the children when she's work? So there's no childcare available for her, perhaps, where she is. So she would place the child into an orphanage. However, having a daycare centre means that she can safely put her child into a daycare while she works, and she picks the child up in the evening. Fantastic. So there's a lot of innovations in Africa, and actually there's a lot that we can learn from a lot of the innovations that we see in Africa.
Well, on that point, actually, that neatly goes into what I wanted to talk about. Certainly in the aid sector, global solidarity sector, there can be like an automatic behaviour of, oh, we're going there and we're improving them, and we're sort of this one-way flow of information. Whereas actually, good development aid work is bidirectional. It goes two ways. What can we learn in Wales and the rest of the West from innovations and behaviours and people in Africa?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I want to give a bit of a shout out to Hub Cymru Africa here, because you are creating that platform for that bi-directional learning rather than it just being one way. So kudos to Hub Cymru Africa for doing that. In terms of, there's all kinds of innovations we're learning from Africa, from the use of solar in certain parts of Africa, farming innovations. As they are more deeply impacted by the climate crisis, they are having to innovate on how to continue and to change and adapt to this new awful climate crisis that they are suffering. We might not see it here in Wales as much as they do, but we see migration of people, we see workers fleeing to cities. So a lot of innovation around farming and rural work there. In terms of my interest, one of the things that we can learn is, and I think we've started to, is look at the way that African families generally absorb children and look after children when there's a crisis. I think in the UK, we've been very quick to remove children and place them into foster care, and that can be quite expensive. And foster care, I'm a fan of foster care, it's fantastic. However, it becomes, we've all heard the horror stories of children bouncing from foster family to foster family with no consistency of care. Well, that's not good for children.
Well, that just replicates the abandonment issues we were talking about at the start.
Exactly. And I understand there is sometimes need for very specialist care because children may have particular difficulties and trauma that they need very, very specific care with. However, I think in Africa, seeing the Child's Eye Foundation and other organisations who are helping to place children into kinship care systems, and the grandmothers raising children because they're daughter or their son can't. And strengthening the whole community structure around care is really something we can learn a lot from. I know there are moves, and there is a big body in the UK who are saying, actually, why don't we equip and train and resource families, grandmothers, or other family members to care for children who are in a precarious situation with their own mum or their own parent. Why don't we do that? And I think that's very healthy. It's cheaper. It keeps children within the family structure. It doesn't remove them. It doesn't, put them at risk. Mm-hmm. In fact, Peter, one of the underreported issues that we've had in the UK of recent years is the whole issue around the grooming gangs. And I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of that, but what I would say is a lot of the young ladies who were survivors of the grooming gangs were in this perpetual cycle of care, either placed in a children's home or bouncing from foster care to foster care. I mean, there are some who were in a healthy family, but they just fell in, or they were victims. Yeah. But I think it's something that we're not talking about enough. And I think even in our own country, let's think about how we can create a more loving, caring environment for children, and actually let's be better parents as well. Quite frankly, parents in every country, there are some really bad parents. So how can we refocus on how to parent children more effectively? And a part of it is a cycle. I mean, you're a bad parent because you were badly parented often. So how can we break this cycle? Yeah. And let's not push all of the responsibility on schools to parent our children. Let's get back to how we parent children. And parenting is different for everyone. And families are in all shapes and sizes. It isn't, a mum and a dad and a child. It can be any variant of that. But it is important that any structure that a child has is safe and that we are parenting properly. So there is a lot we can learn from Africa. Africa has some challenges, so do we. Yeah. So the bilateral learning is really important.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And it strikes me that the sort of the responsibility frame is often seen as quite narrow.
Yeah.
It's either the parents or the schools or the government. Yeah. And where actually what these community hubs, former orphanages in Africa are showing is if you have this more dynamic, nimble, community-wide sort of structure, it actually makes the job of schools and parents easier because it brings in more components and people from the community to be part of that child's life.
Yeah.
There's that famous saying, it takes a village to raise a child, right? That seems to be the lesson coming out of these successful community hubs in Africa. In terms of successful foster care, are there any innovations happening in Wales that could be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, so Wales has been piloting a universal basic income project for young people who age out of foster care. So when they finish foster care, one of the problems with foster care is, of course, it's very much reliant on a foster carer to maintain a relationship with the child. And I know amazing foster carers who do that. So when a child is 18 and they are then legally an adult and they have to make, they have to make a life for themselves, it is very difficult for them. And unless they have an amazing foster family who will maintain that relationship, of course they don't get paid anymore when they're gone 18, then it is difficult. And this is a gap. What Wales have done is to give a universal basic income, so give a monthly allowance to young adults who've left foster care. It's a bit early to talk about the outcomes of that, but the signs are that it has provided a level of stability for some years after these young adults leave care and provide them with some real stability. I think it's a really, really good idea. So kudos for Wales for implementing that. I hope it's something which gets a lot of traction. Other countries are starting to look at and do something similar. So it is an innovation that I think is really important. Foster care also I'm off to Uganda next week. I'll be going to visit a foster care program which started from the closure of an orphanage. So the orphanage closed And the person who helped to close the orphanage started a community project, and the community project is expanded, and there's about 1,000 children now who are in foster care, healthy, happy, long-term. It's very different than foster care in Wales. So foster carers won't receive a whole lot of money. We don't want to monetize foster care in Africa.
Yeah, that was one of the issues of orphanages, right? It was a money-making scheme.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you went to some families and offered them huge amounts of money to foster a child, then that's not sustainable, because the government don't have that level of funds to sustain the foster care. And you can disrupt the family dynamics.
Yeah.
But there are some really good examples of foster care in Africa, and that we could actually learn from as well, Peter, because providing support services around foster care in terms of education, access to services, health, maybe some small allowances, but nothing that's going to break the bank, but really could be quite important for families to help the whole family unit. These innovations are fantastic. So, yeah, there's some really exciting things going on in Wales and in parts of Africa around foster care.
For a listener who's just sat through this episode and they want to support the movement towards family-based care, they want to be a genuine ally. They don't want to be a white savior anymore, and they want to stop these perpetuating colonial dynamics. What can someone do?
Well, the one thing they shouldn't do, if they are currently supporting an orphanage, they shouldn't just say, right, that's it, I've had enough of that, I'm not going to support this orphanage anymore. I would suggest they get involved and they share with the orphanage this kind of information. If you go to the Better Care Network, which I mentioned earlier, there's a huge amount of resources there. There are reports of each of the countries in Africa where they are with their care reform journey. Most countries have an alternative care framework which is helping to move away from institutional care. There are organizations and networks that they can support. They can find examples of this transition and this transformation that I'm talking about with orphanages. Orphanages are also very expensive. So if you think of an orphanage, you've got to pay the staff, you've got to pay the buildings, you've got to feed the kids, you've got to provide education, you've got to provide a nurse or health, etc., etc. It's very expensive. Moving away to a more community-based system is much cheaper, and you get a much wider reach of community members that you can support. So yeah, I think critically about those kind of things. Visit the Hope and Homes for Children website. The blog on the Hope and Homes website is very good. There's some really good articles, and I know we haven't touched on children's choirs which come across, and it's incredibly disappointing that we see them on Britain's Got Talent and things like that, and Elevated. That just takes the focus away from the real work which should be going on, which is to support and strengthen communities. But yeah, there's a lot on our blog about both the damage of institutional care, the alternatives for institutional care, and how people can support. The other thing that we have in Wales is we have a Hope and Homes for Wales supporters group. And I spent Burns Night with them recently, and it was fantastic. Incredibly passionate people, completely understand that orphanages are not a good place for children, and they do some fundraising for us, and equally important, awareness raising. Because if we can really get into the public psyche that orphanages are not good places for children, and we start to transition away from that thinking, I think that we'd be in a really good place. And that's what the movement is all about, Peter.
We'll make sure to add all these links in the episode blurb.
Fantastic.
To end, I just wanted to ask you, what gives you hope at the moment?
What gives me hope is seeing the voices of the young people who've grown up in institutions start to find their voice, and we have to give them that platform. So hopefully in the future, Peter, we can actually speak to some of these young people who grew up in institutional care, and they can tell their stories, because I can't tell their stories. Yeah. I've raised a child from an orphanage, so I know the journey that he's been on, and it's very much his story to tell. And he will definitely tell you that it was a bad experience for him growing up in an institution. But giving these young people, some of them are not so young anymore, a voice is really where we need to be at. That's what gives me hope. In fact, we had a conference in Malaysia end of last year, and a big part of that conference was to mobilize countries together. And a big component of that was bringing the voices of people with lived experience to talk about their experience. And we actually give them the complete platform. We didn't tell them, we didn't prescribe what they should or shouldn't say. They spoke about their experiences, however they wanted to talk about them. And hearing them talk about their experiences and hearing them challenge governments, challenge donors was inspiring. And so that's what gives me hope, the voice of young people. In fact, any social justice movement starts with the people who've been affected by it most.
Absolutely.
The reason why we've made so much progress with HIV/AIDS is because people with HIV/AIDS have fought for the platform to talk about their own experiences. Same with people affected by disabilities. And I think that's the part. So when often people say to me, who are you to tell us that orphanages are wrong? Do you know what? I'm just lucky that I'm a brash, loudmouth Welshman who doesn't care what people think of him. But actually, it's the voices that I'm trying to speak for, because they currently don't have a big enough voice, of the young people who did grow up in an institutional care and who were ripped from their parents and who are now looking for their parents. Peter, can you imagine? You're a young adult, you're applying for a job, and you don't even have a birth certificate. So a lot of children who grew up in orphanages, they are undocumented. They are not registered. They don't have a birth certificate. Can you imagine the trauma that you have to go through when you're 20 years old and you got to go and register your own birth, and you don't know who your parents are, or you do know who your parents are, but you've lost all connections because the orphanage never kept the connections with your parents. It's a human rights travesty. This is a crisis, and I think if anything can come of this podcast is just for people to get a bit motivated to find out more information, get involved, and listen to the voice of care leavers. That's the really, really important thing.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. It's all about amplifying that authentic voice, the voices with the lived experiences. And it's a fair challenge to the podcast. And it's something, we will take on, and absolutely keen and committed to getting these voices back on here. Mark, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn for joining.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much.
And that's it from Wales, Africa and the world. Thank you to Mark for joining me. Thank you very much for listening.